We're continuing with the verses in chapter 9. I was going to say we're proceeding slowly. I would say we're proceeding deliberately. That's a euphemism for slowly. But slowly, deliberately is more along the lines of with due consideration for important points. And the one that came up last week we talked about was a little bit about this verse, 众生无智慧，爱思所上度，未必求菩提，诸佛法如是. And this one has to do with this idea of the injured poisoning by the thorn of love, and what love in all its forms has to do with cultivation. The text, if you look at the text across, you'll see variations of this theme coming up. In its raw, uncultivated form, what we call love, or this mixture of thoughts and feelings and emotions and so forth, is both the stuff of samsara, of continuous, uncontrolled, involuntary, confused existences of dukkha. It's at the root of dukkha and so forth. And yet, if you look at the text carefully, you'll see it's just this very thing, if we can call it that, that is also the raw materials of nirvana and bodhi. And we had this wonderful verse from the Sixth Patriarch that really summarized it. Basically, this nature, this lust nature, at its raw, uncultivated form, turns into the six paths of existence. Turn back, just turn back, let go of, not followed or allowed to take control. The essential nature returns to Buddha. So what you have here is a very interesting kind of equation of, and in that equation you can see then how you deal with this is absolutely critical for liberation or further entanglement and afflictions. You can't, we were talking last week, you can't smash it, you can't cut it off literally, because in doing that you also destroy the very substance of bodhi and awakening. So the whole key in these texts, if you look at them carefully, have to do with working with it and smelting or transforming it into wisdom, liberated existence. And it's done through basically what's called, very interesting, the non-outflow, the 3 non-outflow learning practices, Shila, Samadhi, Prajna. And that methodology, and I say it's a methodology, it's not something you believe in, it's actually something you engage in and do. By engaging in that methodology, using those mechanisms, that and that alone transforms this raw, unsmelted substance into the stuff of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and sages. So then you can see the whole emphasis in this tradition really has to do with the doing of this activity, this actual engagement of this, and not simply a hope that somebody else is going to do it for you, or that if you wait long enough it'll transform itself, or that you can just repress it and then you'll be free. So this is fairly sophisticated. What I find interesting, and you see this in the Shurangama Sutra too, the use of the language flow or flowing, and ashrava, which means outflows, can be taken metaphorically, but I think it also has a non-metaphorical or a more direct meaning of there is, in fact, a flow going on within the mind-body process. And I would argue today, and I'll finish up with this point, that the sages, those we call sages of the past, the present, and to be, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and so forth, really sensitively and intricately understood the very subtle dimensions of this flow of energy within the mind-body continuum. And they were aware of it directly without external means that we might have available now to us to measure through biofeedback mechanisms and so forth. And by becoming acutely and sensitively aware of this, they were able to watch and observe how this moved through their bodies and minds, and how their thoughts affected it, how it affected their thoughts and feelings and so forth. And gradually they freed themselves from the involuntary sway of this energy, channeled it, and actually transmuted it into a profound, unmoving, liberated stillness that also included movement. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight is, and maybe next week too, I'm going to next week go into this a little more. There's 2 areas where science seems to help us understand a little better what I would say these texts are talking about, but actually makes it more explicit. And I think for a modern mind, it maybe could make a little more sense. Next week we'll be talking about, and basically I think this is the area of biochemistry or neuroscience. So I said, and then I was going to drop it. I thought, we talked about love too much last week, so why talk about it again? And then I got a couple of emails and requests of, no, talk about it some more, and especially about the biochemistry of love, which, by the way, I'm not an expert on, but I do look into this material and do study it, and I have science friends who occasionally give me insights into this. So I thought I would share that. And then tonight, we will finish up on love. We will finish up our discussion on love. We won't finish up on love. If we finished up on love and really resolved it, we'd all become awakened tonight, and there'd be no reason for us to have any further lectures or for the Buddhist monastery to exist either. Okay, and the Buddha is very clear about this. I said last night from the Sutra, 42 sections. Last week he said, if there were another thing as strong and powerful as this thing we call love, no one would accomplish the way. So fortunately, we only have one. But this one has many heads, and you cut off one, and it's like a hydra in the Greek mythology, another comes back. So let me go into this a little bit tonight to talk about this chemical dimension, or biochemical or neurochemical. When we say we're in love, and however we use that, it's not just a mental feeling. And in fact, the mental feeling is actually supported and generated by hormonal neurotransmitter flows within the body. And they're racing around your brain and your body when you are, quote, in love. And mainly, I'll talk about a few of them tonight. One is very clearly one called dopamine. Another one is neoepinephrine, related to the kidneys, like epinephrine. And then there's something called phenethylamine. Now, dopamine is actually called, very interesting, the pleasure chemical. It produces a feeling of bliss. Norepinephrine is similar to adrenaline, almost like a speed, like amphetamine, and it produces a racing heart and excitement. So if you go, you say, I'm in love, my feet are tingling, I'm fluttering in my heart. It's just like I have this high. Basically, you're describing something that's just chemical. These are the corresponding feelings, but those feelings are generated from these chemicals. So together, these two chemicals, particularly the dopamine and norepinephrine, produce elation, intense energy, like you're charged up, and also sleeplessness, craving, and loss of appetite, and focused attention. Some of the symptoms of love.
Really?
One scientist says the human body releases the cocktail of love, rapture. The human body releases a cocktail, like it's a drink, of love, rapture. You could say, he continued, that love is a brain bath of dopamine and norepinephrine. Now, I know you don't want to put this on your Valentine's card and say, dear, let us enjoy our brain bath of dopamine and norepinephrine, which means I love you. But really what you're saying when you say I love you is I love love. You've got to be careful here. What you love is the feelings associated with this, that excitement, that intense stimulation. That's what you love. The object of your love is really just a trigger for the release of this self-gratifying. So in a sense, love at this level, I'm not saying love between parent and child and all this, but love at this level is largely, ironically, narcissistic. Love in the neurochemical field is all about brain chemistry, which in turn makes the rest of your body, according to them, go haywire. So this is not considered to be rapture from their point of view. It's saying there is a haywiring, like three-ring circus going on where everything is just running wild and out of control. We call it love. But from their point of view, this is a very dangerous release of chemicals that, if not curtailed or curbed or harnessed in some way, will lead to a lot of suffering and also a lot of biophysical ailment and so forth. So this scientist is saying, I'm quoting him, what is involved in romantic attraction is that in response to an interaction with another person, certain brain centers go bonkers. This is the word he uses. It feels as if we have taken a stimulant like amphetamine or cocaine. Amphetamine is believed to affect the human nervous system indirectly by inducing the brain to release vast amounts of neurotransmitters. So what's happening here is the release, the nervous system indirectly induces the brain to release these bath of neurotransmitters, basically norepinephrine and dopamine. So what I want to just interject here is this. All of this paints maybe not quite the rosy picture we imagine or fantasize about with love. And more than a metaphor, falling in love is more actually what's really happening here. You're suddenly, powerfully attracted. You're swept away. You're falling in a free fall. And so it's like, because mostly you are no longer in control. Once these neurotransmitters are stimulated to release these hormones, the control and power of the hormones are what takes over. Not your will, not your consciousness, not even your vows and promises. You become, in a sense, a conditioned reflexive Pavlovian dog, in a way, who can no longer control. And that's why the Shrangma has this thing about, with a thought moving about sour grapes, the mouth waters. It's very interesting in describing how with a movement of mind, suddenly there's a corresponding flow of juice within the mouth. And we can take this to many dimensions. So, it is these hormones, not the romantic partner. I know this is hard, but it's these hormones that make us feel good, rewarded, and close. However, and these scientists point out, these released hormones can also very quickly be accompanied by and turn into jealousy, erratic behavior, irrationality, and along with a long other list of less than positive emotions and moods. So it's responsible for this elation, but it's also responsible for this delation, and then actually some fairly nasty human behaviors that can lead to outright violence, aggression, murder, and even, they found, very closely related to ethnocentrism. So I'm going to go into this a little more of what I can say. So how does this all work? Basically, we're using what they have now called functional MRI scans so that you can observe the movements, the activity of the brain and the nerve through movement and not just still. And they show an increased blood flow in the areas of the brain with high concentrations of receptors for dopamine. So when those released, the brain activates to almost pick up the dopamine and to respond to it. And this then is associated with states of euphoria, craving, and addiction. So, very interesting, high levels of dopamine are also associated with the release of norepinephrine, my high school, college days, norepinephrine. Epinephrine is speed. So, when this is released, it heightens our attention. We're alert. But it also affects short-term memory. That's sort of dropped. And it produces hyperactivity, sleeplessness, and goal-oriented behavior. So it starts to really focus. And so the love focus intently on a relationship, and it's on anything else. That's why people say he's drunk or blind with love, because now the focus is brought down to this myopic, total concentration for the object of love. And as a result, you don't see anything else. And people will come and say, oh, no, he's not for you. Don't you see? And you say, no, I don't. You don't understand. I'm in love. Which means you're actually locked in now, and you have this obsession. Also, there's another level of drug involved, and this has come up, in the last 34 years, this emphasis on serotonin. And there's serotonin gets involved with this neurochemical hormone transmission swirl that's going on. And it's interesting that lower levels of serotonin levels are the same as those found in people with obsessive compulsive disorders. So the same lower serotonin levels that you see with somebody madly in love is also associated with people with, well, look at it, the focus, totally. I mean, when you see somebody in love, that's all they can think about day after day. We call it love, but if you looked at it clinically, you'd say, it's an obsessive compulsive. They're looking at their phone. Did he or she text me? What's going on? Is she thinking of somebody else? What are we going to do tonight? I mean, you can't focus on your studies. People drop out of school when they're in love. Their jobs fall by the way. They do really silly things. They even ruin their families because they're so focused on this. And that's kind of explains why those in love obsess about their partner. This is what underlies the overpowering infatuation that characterizes what are called the beginning stages of love. So these scientists now have looked into this, very interesting. They say there's three categories of three stages involved. One is called lust, the second is attraction, and the third is attachment. So you're looking along a continuum. Each is characterized, interestingly, by its own set of hormones stemming from the brain. This is really interesting. So in the first stage, lust, basically the dominant hormones are testosterone and estrogen. These are overwhelming and they just flood. The next stage, attraction, that's the dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. They get involved in that. High levels of dopamine and the related norepinephrine are released during attraction, the next stage. These chemicals make us giddy, energetic, and euphoric. They even lead to decreased appetite and insomnia. So when someone's in love, they can hardly eat. They can't sleep. which means you can actually be so in love that you can't eat and can't sleep. What's the cure? In fact, also the norepinephrine is known as noradrenaline. And you all know adrenaline is associated with basically the fight-flight response and fear and whatnot. It's a release of a hyper energizing stimulant. This also happens to release when there's pain and closeness to death. And that's why sometimes people seem to die not feeling pain, because at that moment, the moment of death, from the adrenaline glands, there's a massive release of that hormone that basically floods the system with a kind of euphoric feeling and eliminates the pain, and then you can die rather peacefully. This happens right at the moment of death. The trouble with that is, if you release that prematurely and consistently, you drain your essential energy. You're basically taking your own chemicals and getting high off your own internal chemicals, and they don't replenish that easily. So there's a danger in this that you could actually exhaust yourself and basically impair your health and lead to premature aging and death because you're releasing these things too quickly, not in a natural, measured way as they're supposed to release, and you pay the price. And this one plays a large role, I said, in the flight or fight response, the adrenaline thing, which kicks into high gear when we're stressed and keep us alert. So brain scans of people in love have actually shown that the primary reward centers of the brain, including what they call the caudate nucleus, fire like crazy when people are shown a picture of someone they're intensely attracted to. So now you know the Buddhist thing, the eyes see forms, which stimulates a shift in consciousness, which then stimulates desires, which then stimulates actions, which then stimulates responses, and you get a cycle going on. Desire, action, retribution. Habit, desire, action, retribution, habit, and you get this cycle here. They fire like crazy. Finally, there's something called oxytocin and vasopressin, and they come in with attachment. So these are the next one. We went from lust. Previously, we were describing the attraction, and now the attachment. And that's a primary factor in long-term relationships. Lust and attraction are pretty much exclusive to romantic entanglements. Well, okay, I'm sorry, that was editorializing. Romantic affairs, romantic highs. From this view, they're called entanglements. An attachment mediates friendships. The parent-infant bonding, social cordiality, and many other intimacies as well. So these, I'm not presenting these as, oh, these are all bad. It's about whether you are in control and conscious of what you're doing with them, whether they are controlling you, and how you can use them. For example, in a parent-child relationship or a student-teacher relationship, these hormones are there too, but they're not flooding and overwhelming. They're not going bonkers. So these are the two I'm talking about. Let me just say a little more about dopamine, because that's really one that just rides through all of this. That's the one that most of the studies now in addiction are paying attention to. The same regions of the brain that light up when we're feeling attraction light up when a drug addict takes cocaine or meth, or we binge on sweets. Identical, in other words, stand back, you say, oh, it's love here and it's cocaine here. But when you look at the neurotransmitter, you look at the brain scans, you see exactly the same areas and the same pathways activating. So from a biophysical point of view, there is no difference. One is legal, one's not. But from a medical or even a cultivation point of view, it doesn't matter because those pathways have now been activated. Cocaine maintains a dopamine signaling for much longer than usual, leading to a temporary high. But after the high and the signaling wears off, then the opposite occurs because you've used up that essential energy again. Attraction is basically, and this is a scientist saying, attraction from a physiological, neuroscientific point of view is basically just an addiction to another human being. So from the neurological side, what we call love in this way, this obsessive love, is merely an addiction to not a drug substance, but another human being. And I suppose, as I think about it, it could be any object of desire. It could be a pet. It could be a place. It could be your own image in the mirror. So, the same brain regions light up, interestingly, when we become addicted to material goods. Whoa, this is really interesting. As we become emotionally dependent on our partners. So now you can see the Buddhist thing of saying the six sense objects, sight, sound, smells, taste, tactile things, and even mental fantasies, thoughts, and impulses, and so forth. Basically, once they are activated, they don't distinguish. The outflow is just the same. And basically, when addicts go into withdrawal, it's not unlike love-struck people craving the company of someone they can't be with or see. Or the withdrawal of not losing that loved one. So dopamine runs the reward pathways in our brains. It's kind of okay in moderate doses because it helps us enjoy food, events and plays and theater and so forth, and actually healthy relationships. It's part of that. But when you push that dopamine pathway too far, we become addicted to food, to drugs, or to love and to sex. Similarly, too much dopamine in a relationship can underlie an unhealthy emotional dependence on our partners. And so, on one hand, Oxycontin, the other one I was talking about, can help us feel warm and fuzzy towards our companions, but it's also been associated with fueling prejudice. So when I was studying anthropology, the phrase we had for it was called in-group benevolence, out-group violence. And so that you have we didn't know then the neurochemical support for that. So your in-group, your clan, your tribe, your group, you have this benevolence, this fraternity, the guys, the gals, whatever you call it, this bonding, and you will protect that. And then correspondingly, it's juxtaposed to out-group aggression and violence and rejection. So it's kind of like too much of a good thing can be bad. For example, recent studies on party drugs such as MDMA or GHB shows that Oxycontin may be the hormone behind the feel-good sociable effects that these chemicals produce. These possibilities, when they're taken to extreme, however, cause the user to disassociate from his or her environment and act wildly and recklessly. So they give out kind of a license and abandon where we're no longer in a causal feedback mechanism that we're aware of. We're just acting, reacting. And this is why sometimes in the legal system they consider these to be extenuating circumstances that someone was under the influence at a certain time. But I've heard, and other respectful philosophers say, nonetheless, you're responsible for being under the influence and the actions that stem from this. You cannot claim temporary insanity due to having made. So at some point, even making the choice to become temporarily insane. I mean, look at the toast. Ganbei, empty the cup, right? I think there's one in Sweden that basically, I forget what the toast is in Sweden, Skål or something. There's another one that somebody told me about. It was like basically, goodbye inhibitions. Goodbye restraints. And so it's a kind of way of saying, I am no longer then going to restrain myself, knowing that this, and so the philosopher, and I was Herb Fingered, who's passed away, but he made an argument that addiction of this sort does not excuse your responsibility for your behavior because you're responsible for doing that. Prior to that, the Supreme Court had ruled that alcoholism was a disease, and therefore if you were diseased, you weren't responsible. He did the research and said he didn't think it was a disease at all. It was a habit, and it was a very powerful habit, but it involved steps of agency and therefore responsibility. As a result of his research, the Supreme Court has changed its position on this. And so when I asked him once what he was most proud of, because he did this wonderful book called The Secular as a Sacred, it's a study of Confucianism, and he'd done all kinds of other things. He said that one piece that got published in the Harvard Law Review, because he wasn't a lawyer, he's a philosopher, that caused the Supreme Court to change their position on this, was one he was most proud of because he felt he was a philosopher engaged in the world and not just simply doing abstraction. But it follows along what we're seeing, looking at here. Let's see. what happens, and this is very interesting as they do the brain studies, when there's sexual arousal, this is very, very powerful. You see this in animals. I've made the mistake backpacking to get in the space of animals that are what you would call not mating. The thing before mating is called...
In heat?
Huh?
In heat?
Louder.
In heat. You said in heat.
Yeah.
Courting.
Heating.
Courting.
Yeah, they're in heat, right, but there's another word.
Flirting in it.
Yeah, they're not flirting. This is taken over. I made the mistake of getting in between a female elk and a male elk. And there I was backpacking. The male elk did not read me as a backpacker, but as a threat, and charged me with horns down. Fortunately, I was able to find a little bridge and slip underneath and escape. I made this mistake a couple of times out in nature. You do not reason with bears in heat or elk in heat. And they will kill and destroy when they're driven by this. And afterwards, it's very easy. You can go up and pet them sometimes, but not when. So when that takes over, it appears from the MRI to turn off regions in our brain that regulate critical thinking, self-awareness, and rational behavior. These areas of the brain associated with critical thinking, self-awareness, and rational behavior basically shut down or go into dormancy when sexual arousal occurs. And these are including maybe what they say is the prefrontal cortex. So in short, love makes us dumb. I mean, I just summarize this. And OxyContin has been suggested to play a role in ethnocentrism, increasing our love for people in already established cultural groups and making those unlike us seem foreign, outsiders, and then threats, enemies, and eventually, when you push it, not even humans, but things. So you can see with this ethnocentrism, for example, with the Nazi ideology of a chosen race, and gradually they became less than human, and finally they were relegated to the vermin. And this isn't just the Nazis. You see this in every conflict of war. The enemy, then, the outgroup, is reduced from their humanity to something that is not even human. Therefore, your aggressive, violent actions to eliminate them are not really hurting people. You're getting rid of vermin. So this has a hormonal correspondent. And I would say sometimes when you have demagogues whose rhetoric can inflame this in-group, out-group thing, if you could track this, you would see the biochemical change occur in the audience as they were picking this up. You could actually see that if you could do this in colors, you would actually see not just their thoughts or their rational, you could actually see hormones being stimulated by this that would then overtake rational self-awareness, critical thinking, and more importantly, an innate empathy and compassion we have for living things gets truncated by this. So I guess maybe I'll just end tonight with this thought. I didn't mean to overwhelm, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg on this research. It's very interesting. It becomes more compelling. I think one thing it's showing us is that we are far less in charge of ourselves than we think we are. And this is not just thought. This is biochemistry. There's a non-dual relationship between thought and biochemistry that's going on here. None of this is new to Buddhism. This is what's interesting. And what I would say is that cultivators, people who are cultivating, actually taking up and practicing this methodology, have done for ages is to know yourself. But to know yourself in this sense is not simply to know your ideas or to know your philosophy or even to know your values. It's to know how you work, moment to moment, thought to thought. What's being generated? What's moving through you? What's in charge? How are you responding? And basically to contemplate and observe and get a handle and transform this mind-body arena is what it's all about. I would argue, for example, if you look at the 5 precepts, the 10 precepts, the 250 precepts, you look at the lifestyles and the idea of livelihood, and why all these texts are talking about even diet and what you drink and what you smell and so forth as being part of this. Why are they doing that? Because they're keenly aware. They didn't do this because these were presented to them as law. These are the 5 precepts you should obey of. You should not eat meat and drink and become drunk and so forth. You should not. No, this wasn't handed down like tablets. They discovered these organically in the process of trying to get a handle on their thoughts, feelings, and emotions, trying to get in charge of their mind and bodies, and in doing that, discovered, hey, when I eat meat, it sends shock waves and hormones and things through my body that swirl up and cause all these feelings and so on and so forth. And when I don't, a corresponding peace and openness and compassion. And so they started to do, basically in a very empirical, scientific way, experiment on the mind-body continuum with their thoughts, their actions, and their words, and observed which ones cause this, which ones cause that, and eventually came up with a system that we call self-cultivation. If you want to call it Buddhism, I don't like to call it that, but the study and practice of these teachings, that is basically a workout along the lines of getting a handle on the stuff. They didn't call it norepinephrine or dopamine, but they were certainly aware of this. And I would say if you actually hold precepts purely and you begin mindful practice, you will become aware of this without machines and without neuroscientists telling you. You will be able, in fact, the Sixth Patriarch says, how could you not be aware of it? How did you lose this sensibility? So this sensibility is said to be part of the nature, it's innate, and only by tuning into it and listening to it and observing it do we get the teacher, the Shan Jirshu, the good and knowing advisor we need to actually liberate ourselves. Because if it's coming from a teacher outside or even from a text, it's not knowing for yourself. It's not like the Kalama Sutra says you should know for yourself that something is kushala or akushala. And until you know that, it's not yours. But you can know it. So I'm arguing here that they gained mastery of this reflexive knee-jerk swirl and turned it into prajna by precept, samadhi, and wisdom. And I think that's the meaning of this quote, and I'm going to give it to you from the Sixth Patriarch Sutra. This is what the Sixth Patriarch, I think, is describing. Although we flushed it out in great sort of biophysical detail, the statement that he's giving is the essence of it. And he says, ordinary people are themselves Buddhas. And affliction itself is bodhi, or you could say these hormone neurotransmitters and so on and so forth, all of this, including the organs and the sense organs and so forth, all of this, when used correctly, mastered, is bodhi, and when not, it's affliction, it's klesha. In one past moment of confused thought, you're just an ordinary person, caught up reflexively in this swirl. If the very next thought is awakened and clear, you are a Buddha. And so it's chemically, biochemically, thought to thought, moment to moment. Previous thoughts clinging to sensory states are klesha, afflictions. And succeeding thoughts unattached, not repressing, unattached to them is bodhi. And so what you're getting here is a very interesting equation that's saying it's dynamic, it's active, it's ever present, but you have to work it. And that working it requires awareness. But sometimes awareness without precepts doesn't happen. So the precepts give you a space to increase your awareness. The awareness gives you a guide to, oh, these precepts make sense. And the more you do that, the more the awareness increases, and eventually it turns into what's called prajna or wisdom. So I'm trying to sort of take a text passage here and then take it apart sort of in a neuroscientific way and realize that's what they're dealing with when they cultivate. They're keenly aware of this. And we have that capacity, and it's only to be feared, I guess you could say, that we don't use that capacity. So, as it says, I think in the one of my favorite Confucian passages from the Nushan, Cow Mountain, rightly tended, taking care of no creature but thrives. Neglected, no creature but pines away. As to its comings and goings, who knows where it will rest or abide? What was this talking about? The mind. And the mind in this text is talking not only about your thoughts and ideas, but it's talking about the biochemical. This is also the mind. And so this is what it's talking about. So the text, although they're ancient, really are hitting this right on the head. And I think as we do more of this, we begin to understand how we might get better mastery over this. I don't want to say repression or control, or even controls even sounds a little harsh, but ease at being able to use this. Okay, so that's all on love. Jin Chuan is going to talk. I bet he's going to talk about love too. So,
Hey, Marty?
yes.
So people are interested in the source/study of your biochemical article.
In the what?
In your, your
Sources,
research.
source material.
Source material.
They want to read for themselves.
Chemical
They want to know
cocktail.
for themselves.
The source material. Well, if I were to be like the sixth pager, I could say, you are in fact the source material for all of this. How come you don't know? But if you want to, I can pull together some studies and things like that for some footnotes and people can look into. I'm glad some people are finding it interesting, because rather than an obstacle to cultivation, this kind of research can actually be an extremely helpful aid for us to understanding what's going on. And I might say, interestingly, it gets you out of guilt. Because you realize once you start one of these triggers going and they take over, it's not a question that, oh, I should, it's like, how do I get back to the place before the horse is out of the barn? And so it becomes descriptive rather than judgmental. That's why even with my teacher, he would say, everything is a test to see what you will do. If you recognize what's before you, fine. If you don't, you'll have to start anew. But the idea is, no, you're not doomed and you're going to hell. It's just start over. But without a mechanism to observe and a somewhat scientific schema to work with, you're just hit or miss. You're just wandering in the dark, swinging at this stuff. But if you can actually understand how it works, and it's very explicit how it works, you actually then have a way to get into it. And I would say, from the Buddhist point of view and from the scientific point of view, this is, quote, and I'm sorry, oh, you're going to be essentialist. I'm not. It's universal. This cuts across all human and maybe larger, but the Buddhists would say all living beings have these structures. And so it's intersubjectively testable. This isn't true of Americans and not true of Chinese, or true of Filipinos, but not true of Mexicans, and so on and so forth. This is the underlying neural fabric of the human being. And these teachings are the underlying gateways to liberation across that spectrum. So this is important too. Okay, I'm going to stop.
So another quick question here is, what is the bottom line of the Buddha's teaching in lifetime besides from procreation?
In what? I've missed the last part.
Well, the person is asking, aside from procreation, what is the bottom line of the Buddha's teaching?
I didn't understand. I don't think the bottom line of the Buddhist teaching is procreation.
Aside from, all these talk about, procreation and so forth.
I'm not
I'm not sure I understand the question either. But
Maybe they can retype it.
Yeah, maybe they can submit it again. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question, but it's interesting. I'm glad nobody fell asleep, or somebody fell asleep. It's really interesting. And as I say, in one sense, this is another part of the one great matter. Getting mastery and understanding over these very, very powerful instincts and passions and powers working through us. And you got to be patient with this. You got to take time. And I would say, from my own experience, none of this can be, quote, put down without a corresponding picking up of something that's even more satisfying and more liberating. None of this is going to be seen in a negative light unless you've experienced directly something else that's much more positive. And that's why the knowing for yourself is extremely important. You can't do this by faith or belief or fear. It has to be, oh my gosh, once I've experienced this, I don't want to, I don't wish to do that. Not because that's a should or should not, but because it's not satisfying in a deeper sense. That's the line I try to, once you've known a contentment that comes from simply being content there's no other way you'll ever be contented again. So anyways, I'll stop there. Jin Chuan, you was going to...
Yeah, I was gonna, maybe like we can show that, the PDF. So given the time, I won't go into a lot of detail, but I wanted to point to this chart because I found it extremely helpful for me to actually tease out what Marty was talking about tonight, and also actually an illustration of how you can still engage the world, but from a different place and from a kind of a positive energy. So here, this verse says, living beings without wisdom are injured and poisoned by the thorn of love. To cause those people to seek bodhi, or awakening, bodhi is another word for awakening, is what the Buddha Dharma is for. And so here on this chart, you'll see one column says tanha, which means thirst or craving. You can say here, I would say it's the word for love. The other column says chanda, and you can maybe add something to it if you want to. Say kushala chanda, meaning wholesome. This is wholesome desire. And I would say this is the spirit of seeking bodhi, of seeking awakening, seeking goodness. And so these are interesting ways to look at it, is to say there's one side of our process which is based on craving. There's another side of our process which is based on wholesome desire. And if we use the side on wholesome desire, it actually leads us to goodness and leads us to awakening. And so this chart actually comes from a book by Ajahn Payutto, who's a Thai scholar monk, very respected by the Thai forest monks. The Biochemistry monks came from Bulgaria and gave me one of these, it's like a tome. It's a huge book, and it says Buddha Dharma on it. And Ajahn Jayasaro, very respected in their tradition, wrote the foreword and said, if he was stuck on a desert island, the one book he'd bring is this book by Ajahn Payutto. So if you just look at the chart, the first one is a basic definition. And so the basic definition for tanha, or craving, or love in this context, is desire, craving, thirst, the desire to obtain, the desire to acquire, the desire to exist or to not exist, the desire to consume. So this kind of wanting to consume, to gratify this, or this wanting to be something. I need to be something, or I want to not be anything. I don't like who I am. I need to get rid of myself, right? That's the side of craving, tanha. People know in the Buddhist tradition, there's usually three kinds of tanha. The tanha, or the craving for sensual pleasure, the tanha, or the craving for becoming, and the tanha, or craving for non-becoming, to not exist. Now on the other side, for chanda, he writes, there's delight, there's satisfaction, there's enthusiasm. He used the word here love, but I would say in a kind of positive sense. A desire, a love of truth, a love of goodness, a desire for knowledge, a desire to act. Now the next kind of just row here, he actually gives the doctrinal definition. And I'll just give the simple definition, which is in the parentheses. It's a simple definition of tanha is selfish desire, the desire for self-gratification, desire for the self to exist or cease to exist in a particular way, which I just went over, the three kinds of tanha. Now chanda is very interesting. So this was, to me, was the kind of moment of like, oh, aha. Because I never got this so clearly articulated before. Like, because we always sometimes say, oh, desire is bad. And actually that's not the case in the Buddhist tradition. It says you have to be very careful how you use the word desire, because desire is also what motivates us in the practice. So here it says, the desire for goodness and integrity. That's wholesome desire. The wish to bring about such goodness and integrity in ourselves, in a situation that's going on in the world, to bring a kind of wholeness, a goodness, and integrity, right? That's really wholesome. And then he really breaks this down. You can take a look at the whole chart, but he goes over the process, and it matches what Marty just went over in the science quite well. And he says, what's the process for tanha? It begins with ignorance having a feeling. Right, so we have this experience of something pleasurable, unpleasurable, or neutral. With ignorance, we're just kind of like going along, kind of just wrapped in our own world. And then we have this experience of pleasure, and since we're not really using wisdom, we just go with the feeling. Oh, I like that feeling, so we have craving. And we go and we start seeking after it. Right? Or something we don't like, so we have an aversion. Oh, I don't like this. So what do? We distract ourselves from it by going after something we like, so we can avoid that feeling of aversion of something, or something that's painful. Right? So this is the process for craving, for tanha. In this context, quote unquote love. We want to be sensitive to how we use love. The other side for chanda's process, it begins with wise reflection. And in the Buddhist tradition, there's many kinds of wise reflection. For instance, there's a wise reflection on the Four Noble Truths, or formulated within the sense of gratification. It says there's gratification, there's danger, and there's the escape. So when there's a sense pleasure that's before us, we know, oh, this brings short-term pleasure, but it also brings long-term negative consequences. So if I really want to get free of this, then I need to engage this object in a skillful way, like what Marty was talking about. When we see something, we don't lose our ability to reflect carefully on what's going on. So with that wisdom, then what happens is then we begin to have this wholesome enthusiasm in terms of how we engage the object. And we have, the next one is perseverance. Then we continue on this journey. In this, he writes a whole chapter on this. So he gives an example, let's say, for instance, being like a doctor. So he wants to be a doctor. Well, we can be a doctor for sense pleasures, or for a feeling of becoming. Like, I want status. I want to be respected by other people. I want to have the money and pleasures that comes along with, making a salary of like a doctor. Right? That would be on the process of tanha, craving. And when I don't get those things, maybe I don't make so much money, or maybe somebody disrespects me, or I lose my job, I'm really angry. I'm upset because my craving is not being fulfilled. Now, you can have the same, you could say, motivation to, or say from the outside, the external, to become a doctor. But with wise reflection, you see, well, what is a doctor really, what can they actually do? Well, they can heal people. They can help people. So my reason for becoming a doctor, so I can heal people. And as I do medicine, I'm trying to help people get better. So every time I'm working as a doctor, I'm actually having enthusiasm, a kind of hard work ethic, because I'm healing people, I'm helping people, and as they get better, I'm happy. There's a kind of mutual positive feedback. Whereas if I'm a doctor for, say, negative motivations, I want money, I want kind of power and status, then the people who come for the medicine are kind of disposable. If they give me more money, or if they give me more status, then yeah, okay, then I'll help out. But I'm going for the status. And if I can get the status without actually doing any work, fine, I just go for the status, right? So this is how you see that if we really look carefully at our deeper motivations, and we can base on this wholesome enthusiasm, we live a life that's much more energetic in a sustained way. It's not like a kind of burnout energy. It's a sustained hard work ethic that actually delivers in terms of a sense of well-being and goodness. I won't go over all of it, but I thought you could just see from this chart is actually quite comprehensive. But maybe just look at the mental consequences, which we went over a little bit last week as well. He says, what does tanha, craving, cause? Anxiety, agitation, lack of concentration, just like what Marty was going over because of the internal hormonal kind of stimulations. It produces a sensual pleasure, a kind of material happiness, a happiness that's dependent on the body. This is a dependent happiness, meaning this happiness requires external things to make me happy. Whereas chanda, this wholesome enthusiasm, brings what? An ease, a peace, composure. Chanda is conducive to concentration, right? Good for meditation. For instance, one may rejoice in someone else's virtue, in a teaching, in the beauty of nature, in one's mind that is tranquil, concentrated, firmly established. Is that this kind of wholesome enthusiasm is conducive to mental health. and it's based on a refined happiness, a non-material happiness. This happiness is not based on the body, and this happiness is an independent happiness, meaning it doesn't get caught up in all the external things. So the very end, I just want to point to, he says, what's the way of practice recommended by the Buddha? So for the tanha, the most direct way, he says, is craving should be uprooted and eliminated. Whenever it arises, you let it go, let it cease. By using your wisdom and wholesome enthusiasm, you curb the craving. He also goes over a strategic way where you can use craving to abandon craving. I won't maybe go that right now, but I think if you want an easy story to look at for that one, is there's a story of the Buddha's, I think, cousin named Handsome Nanda, who the Buddha kind of brought to the people know the story. He brought his, I think his cousin, who just got married to a very beautiful wife, to the monastery, and he actually left home, but he was really attached to his wife. He really wanted to go back to his wife. So the Buddha actually brought him to the heavens. He saw the pleasures in the heavens. He says, wow, this is so much better than my wife at home. So he was cultivating for the pleasures of the heavens. But then the Buddha showed him the sufferings that comes once the heavenly blessings end. He was going to go to describes this kind of the hell realms where there was kind of a lot of suffering. And by seeing that, he said, oh wow, these pleasures that I'm seeking after are not lasting. And then he really started applying effort in his cultivation and actually become an arhat. So he started with craving, but he let go of that, right? On the other side, for chanda, it says you practice chanda by generating it and following it accordingly. So you use wise reflection, you understand the situation, and then you have a wholesome enthusiasm for doing something well, a goodness, a virtue, awakening, right here. It says for realizing bodhi. And when you finish the action, what's interesting, it says when you actually complete the action, chanda naturally disappears because you've completed the action. I mentioned the doctor, you healed somebody, okay, you're done. You fulfilled that, you go into your next thing. So chanda naturally completes itself. So I think was for me a really useful kind of self-reflection as I go about my day-to-day life. I say even being a monk is my motivation for being a monk so that I can get, respected by people or this or that, well, ideally not. That would be getting caught up in the realm of craving. Rather than the chanda, I think the monastic life, for me, what's inspiring about it is that it's a life of goodness. It's a life where we can walk on a path that leads to awakening. And so, as an example, for instance, when we do our daily meals, right? One was you can go through the mind of craving. You can go for food and try to get sensual pleasures. But in the monastic training, a lot of it is actually trying to use the Avatamsaka Sutra to reflect on the food. That, here's the food. This is for my daily sustenance, so I have strength to cultivate. But even more with the Avatamsaka spirit, I am taking this food with the wish that I can be of service to all living beings. So that becomes the deeper motivation for eating, for sustaining ourselves. And I think this is super practical because we're doing things throughout our days all the time, so we can reflect more deeply on what's motivating us. Is it tanha or is it a wholesome chanda? So maybe I'll just share that. If you're interested in the book, maybe we can share the PDF. It's hard to find online, but if you would like, maybe we can send it to people. Okay.
I think, too, the value of the way we were taught and trained is even more important today. For example, you have what's called the inspired tradition and you have the received tradition. The received tradition is the texts. However, what you've just done here is to show that one word desire in English can't cover the range of meanings psychologically that these texts talk about. And so when you say just cut off desire, cast out love, it's a very crude kind of English use of that. And you see the psychological nuance of different forms along a continuum. That's actually why you would study the text and get involved in translation in these languages, is to bring out this nuance, because if you're going to render it back into English or into Polish or Italian or French or Swahili or whatever, without understanding that, you find not only the idiomatic equivalent, but the therapeutic equivalent in the language to liberate people. So that's the importance of translation, a study of text. The inspired tradition is if you don't cultivate yourself in a laboratory way and directly work with this, you might have the literary aspect of it down, but you won't be able to address the psychological, emotional dimensions that you yourself are dealing with, much less with other people, and actually understand deeply what the text is saying and not simply be able to parrot it. So that combination of study, practice, of the receive, the inspire, back and forth, that's the whole, the whole bag. That's a whole kit and caboodle right there. And it's a lifelong thing, but without both of those in some kind of complement, it's very easy to get one-sided. If you only have your experience, you could actually dismiss the subtlety and nuance of this and actually end up attaching to a state of cultivation. On the other hand, if you have this without cultivation, it's sterile. It's just doesn't reach into the human liberating mechanism. So, study, practice, received, inspired. It's basically what we're all committed to and trying to do. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to start learning these languages and start looking into it, and in conjunction with a really sincere and deep practice. That being said, do we have announcements about things coming up or more online?
Yeah, we just have our regular online programs as usual. Do you see anything, Jingwei Shi, that we have special that's coming up? Yeah, nothing particular to BBM community. We have.
Go to website.
Yeah, you can look at our Berkeley Monastery website. If you want to sign up to recite the Great Compassion Mantra, we started a Great Compassion Mantra. Well, it's been ongoing already for quite a few months. They have 10,000 recitations over the last month, I think. 380 people participating. So if you want to join that group, you can sign up online on our website and basically say how many Great Compassion Mantras you want to recite for the month.
It is one that this class also will be extended for whole summer, right?
This class will be extended for the summer.
Extended for the summer.
I don't know if it will be extended for this. I don't know if I'll be extended for the summer. I don't know if I'll be extended for another week. But if I'm not extended, the class can go on. That's not the issue. There's two issues. One, I need to do my own solitary retreat during the summer somehow, but the place I usually go to is difficult to get to because of the COVID issues. So I don't know how that's going to work out. But secondly, there's the beginning of talk of opening things up again. I have no idea where that's coming from, but we will keep everybody informed when we feel it's safe and responsible to begin having more people come to the monastery. There's been a lot of pressure by various, quote, religious groups to open up again, but just in our county of Mendocino, north of here, they had some event at a church, and it became a super spreader and knocked the cases of COVID right up again. So I think we're going to err on the side of caution here. I think this format is working. It's not ideal. But then to definitely let you know when there's a change where you can come to the monastery and do things. And I'm guessing even if there's a change, it'll still be rather cautious and restrictive. It won't be just everybody gathering and hanging out together. So this class with me here will certainly go until the end of May, which is just a few days, and then play it by ear for the rest of the summer. I know there's a number of online courses. Doug and Heng Sure are continuing their courses throughout the summer. And if I'm around, I may do that, but it's equally important for me to disappear from all of you and everything for a while. The world is too much with me later soon. So if I can't do that, I'll have to find another way to do it. And I honestly say this with all due respect. If I'm around here, I'm found here. I'm sorry. It's either text, it's emails, it's knocks on the door, and part of my ability to sustain myself throughout the year involves profound periods of stillness, then being able to engage in movement again. They aren't non-dual completely for me yet. So, and it's not like I'm going off to, play golf and tour the world. I just basically disappear with a dog and my meditation tent down by a lake. No Wi-Fi, no internet, no telephone. For some it's hell, for me it's heaven. So anyhow, that being said, we'll definitely let you know, and if the class is going to continue in another format for the summer, we'll let you know too.
So we're for sure having class next week, though. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So next week. So it'll be week by week. So next week we'll have class.
Yeah, we don't want to end on love, so we'll move on to something else. I guess we'll do the transfer.
Bodhi. We could say that was Bodhi. We ended on Bodhi.
We should end on Bodhi.
We were
Okay.
seeking Bodhi. See, it's not love. It's seeking Bodhi.
All you need is Bodhi.
All you need is Bodhi. That's right.
May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the Venerable Master.